Keith Hankins has a passion for agriculture and has been developing his knowledge for the past 5 years. Besides working in his own garden, he has spent 3 years working on and visiting farms and gardens in the South and across the West Coast. As an intern, personal gardener, and gardening consultant. He's also the author of the book, The Greenhorn Gardening Guide, which will be available at the end of the class from teachservices.com. But for that, without further ado, go ahead, Keith. Did you just kick off?
Can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let me talk fast before something else happens. Okay, so the title of my class today is Life from the Soil, and it's a focus on soil fertility. First of all, I just want to say thank you guys for getting on, all of you. I'm not sure how many of you there are, but I appreciate you being patient and staying on the webinar tonight. I want to share something super practical with you this evening in the simplest terms, and something you can hopefully start implementing, tomorrow or next week. The objective of the webinar today is to learn how to increase soil fertility in our gardens for free or cheap, using the resources around you in order to grow disease-free, pest-free, and nutrient-dense. So first,
You've muted.
Muted yourself, Keith. Keith.
okay,
Here we
how
go.
about now?
Okay, now we hear you.
Okay, I don't know how I did that, but all right. So I'm going to begin by reading a quote entitled "Give Practical Lessons," and it reads, "Of the almost innumerable lessons taught in the very processes of growth, some of the most precious are conveyed in the Savior's parable of the growing seed. It has lessons for old and young. Let the children themselves prepare the soil and sow the seed. As they work, the parent or teacher can explain the garden of the heart with the good or bad seed sown there, and that as the garden must be prepared for the natural seed, so the heart must be prepared for the seed of truth. No one settles upon a raw piece of land, no one settles upon a raw piece of land with the expectation that it will at once yield a harvest. Diligent, persevering labor must be put forth in the preparation of the soil, the sowing of the seed, and the culture of the crop. So it must be in the spiritual sowing." So there's several things we can take away from this passage, but first I want to focus on the analogy that the garden or the soil is the heart, and that diligent, persevering labor must be put forth in the preparation of it. This makes me think of Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, which says, "Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life." We know that in order to grow food out of a garden, we must be diligent in our maintenance of it. This is key when it comes to building and maintaining soil health. The soil is a resilient organism, but the neglect or abuse of it quickly shows up in our food and environment. Jeremiah 17:9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things, desperately wicked. Who can know it?" Without proper and diligent care, the soil brings forth weeds, thorns, and thistles. And as some of you may know, weeds, thorns, and thistles die hard, and they're desperate to live. Some of us would even say they're downright wicked. So I think this verse is pretty applicable to when you're just neglecting your garden. So we have to make sure we're staying on guard by not neglecting the garden or the hard work in the beginning, because it just ends up as difficult or harder labor in the end. One more quote. Many are unwilling to earn their bread by the sweat of their brow, and they refuse to till the soil. But the earth has blessings hidden in her depths for those who have courage and will and perseverance to gather her treasures. And Luke 6:45 says, a good man out of the good treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is evil. For of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaketh. Now this verse in terms of gardening can mean that good soil or healthy soil brings forth good, healthy treasures or food. And the inverse is also true, that an unhealthy soil would bring forth unhealthy or not fully nutritious food, and maybe even diseased food. And this makes sense because often in an unhealthy or struggling garden, it seems as though problems, pests, diseases grow out of the soil right with the plants. And it's because they do. How can we fix this? How can we bring good treasures and blessings out of our gardens? Well, let's quickly read one more passage, the parable of the sower, and see what new lessons we can learn from it, and then talk about some practical ways that we can grow better gardens. So we're going to read the parable of the sower, which is in Matthew chapter 13, and starting in verse 3. And he spake many things unto them in parables, saying, Behold, the sower went forth to sow. And when he sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the fowls came and devoured them up. Some fell upon stony places where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up, because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. But other fell into good ground and brought forth fruit, some an hundredfold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. So there's many lessons we can learn from this passage, but one important lesson when it comes to gardening is to choose wisely the type of land to grow on. We know from an earlier quote that no one settles upon a raw piece of land with the expectation that it will at once yield a harvest. You have to put forth diligent, persevering labor. In light of that, I recommend starting off with land that is not stony, not thorny, and not dry or hard, so as to avoid unnecessary labor. From the parable, we can see that seeds sown in bad ground do not thrive. Time and effort spent there is often wasted. Of course, if you don't have access to good land, then what we're going to learn tonight will be all the more helpful. With the right techniques, bad soil can be revised and revived to bring forth food. But if you do have good soil, definitely use it. We'll discuss what good soil is in a moment, but let's read one more passage found in 2 Peter chapter 1 that I find encouraging for the development of both physical and spiritual gardens. Let's see. And to give all diligence and add to our faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity. For if these things be in you and abound, they make you that ye shall neither be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's 2 Peter 1, 5 through 8. I just love how that correlates so perfectly with creating garden and building the soil. So, what is soil? Well, there are four main types of soil, which are clay soil, which has microscopic soil particles. There's sandy soil, which has mostly large soil particles. There's silty soil, which has medium-sized particles somewhere in between clay and sand. And then the fourth is loamy soil, which is a mix of three soils and can lean either to the clay or sandy side. All of these soils have their own pros and cons, such as sandy soil drains fairly quickly and clay soil holds on to water really well. But depending on where you live or what you're growing, the pros often can become cons and vice versa. For example, if it's raining a lot and you have clay soil, it tends to hold on to the water and become bogged down with water, which isn't healthy for plants. Or if you live in a really dry place and you have sandy soil, if whenever it rains, the sand just drains out all the water, which isn't very helpful either. So since the objective of this class is to learn how to improve the soil no matter what kind, I'm not going to delve into the specifics of each one, except to emphasize again that virtually all soils can be worked and improved, and the principles that we'll learn tonight will help to improve all these types of soils. So let's talk about organic matter. One of the ways in which we can improve the soil is by adding organic matter, which comes from the decayed material of plants, animals, and other previously living organisms. Organic matter is naturally found in many environments, such as leaf litter in a forest, the decaying roots of old plants, or the manure of livestock. And over time, it improves the fertility of the topsoil. And it's usually found in the top 5 inches of the soil. This is where most plant roots hang out to gather food, nutrients, and minerals that they need in order to thrive. We'll continue to see how vital organic matter is to soil health as we discuss this topic further. Moving on, we know that soil is made up of many different kinds of minerals. The minerals or compounds that plants need a lot of are called macronutrients, and what they need a lesser amount of are called micronutrients. When the nutrients are properly balanced in the soil, plants are better able to develop and function in order to complete their life cycle and bear fruit. Now, when it comes to being able to know whether your soil is balanced, there's really only 2 ways to know. One would be, let's see, we'll just keep that slide there. One way of being able to know if your soil is balanced is if you're able to grow food without pests, if you don't have pest pressure, without diseases, if you notice that you're not having much disease problem in your gardens, and if you don't have to use excessive fertilizer. And the other 3 ways would be if your food that you grow has vibrant color, exceptional flavor, and a great aroma. Vibrant color, exceptional flavor, and a great aroma. These 6 qualities of food are the best indication of the health of the food and a pretty good indicator of the health of the soil. More on that, it's just I don't know if anyone else has noticed from their gardens, but food grown in a garden, it has way more flavor than anything you can get in a grocery store, especially like when you cook it, it holds flavor much better. When you put seasonings or anything like that. And I can't imagine how they don't, because vegetables from the grocery store just don't have flavor. They're lacking in nutrients. The other way, or the second way to know if soil is balanced is soil testing, which is a bit more scientific and a bit more involved. It's not free though, or cheap, and I'm trying to focus on free and cheap ways that we can improve the soil. So we're not going to talk about soil testing that much, but I will say that if you want to go the soil testing route, I'd only recommend it if you're growing in a space that is like 1,000 square feet or bigger, because much smaller than that, and the recommended mineral and fertilizer application rates will be so small that it won't make much sense. So if you're going to do some soil testing, it's better if it's on a larger scale. Another reason I'm not discussing soil testing and fertilizers in this class, for the most part, is because it tends to lead to a chemistry-focused paradigm for soil health versus a more holistic, natural way to build soil health. Here's an example. When chemical fertilizers became popular in the 1940s, many people started to focus on inputting large amounts of macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, etc., not realizing that they were beginning to destroy the soil. Since these fertilizers were water soluble and readily available for plant absorption, they caused plants to develop, function, and bear fruit very quickly, but plants became dependent upon fertilizer as they were essentially being bottle fed. They needed to be doused with chemicals to keep pests away. They were missing vital nutrients for the health of the plant and the health of those consuming the plant. And besides all of this, the imbalance created by these substances caused the soil itself to begin to die. Yes, the soil is alive, and the soil can die. If you were to walk outside and go look at your garden, you would see plants, you'd see soil, but you'd have to kneel down to see more, like ants, beetles, maybe some worms. And if you use a magnifying glass, you would see even more. You might see tiny little insects, or you might see more, you might see more. But if you took a microscope and put it over the soil, you would see that a whole new world opens up before you. Why is this? The soil contains hundreds of trillions of living creatures, which make up the ecology of the soil, or as microbiologist Dr. Elaine Ingham has coined, the soil food web. According to Oregon State University, a single teaspoon or 1 gram of rich garden soil can hold up to 1 billion bacteria, several yards of fungal filaments, several thousand protozoa, and scores of nematodes. It's just tons of life inside the soil. And each creature plays a crucial role in the health and balance of the soil. Over many years, scientists, biologists, agronomists, entomologists, chemists, farmers, and gardeners have all studied the soil to discover what lives there and what their function might be. And they all agree that they've barely scratched the surface. But enough is known to understand that the soil is far more than just dirt. There's definitely life in the soil. So let's take a quick look at how these different parts of the soil, these bacteria, fungi, worms, and so forth, work together to encourage plants in healthy and vigorous growth. So after a seedling breaks through the soil surface, germination, and comes into contact with rays of light from the sun, it begins the process of photosynthesis, where it uses energy from the sun to convert water, carbon dioxide, and other essential elements into carbohydrates and other compounds in order to advance its own development. Plants then send carbohydrates or sugars and other substances through their roots into the soil. These are called root exudates. Let's keep in mind that, as in the human world, nothing is free in the biological world or in the soil world, the plant world. And this is in the sense that there is a give and take action going on here. Everyone in the soil is bartering for something that they need. If it isn't supplied, then they eventually stop doing business with you. And that's either because they can get it somewhere else or because they're dead. So you have to pay attention to that give and take. If you're taking something from the soil, you need to be giving something back. Continuing on, while plants are doing all of that photosynthesis and the like, there are large soil dwellers like worms, which are recycling organic matter, soil, and anything else that's in their pathway in the soil. What comes out of worms is called vermicast, or worm manure, which is high in nutrients and high in plant growth hormones. Then there's other smaller soil dwellers like protozoa and nematodes, which are hunting for other smaller organisms like bacteria. And when they eat the soil and eat the bacteria, what they leave behind is also high in bioavailable or plant absorbable nutrients. Besides these guys, the worms, protozoa, nematodes, are the fungi and bacteria, and they're probably the most important contributors to soil ecology. One of the things that they desire most, fungi and bacteria, is carbon. So when carbohydrates or carbon-laden root exudates flow into the soil from plant roots, many different kinds of bacteria and fungi clamor to exchange what they have to give to plants. It's a give and take. So what are they trying to exchange? Well, Jenny Cow Niffen of Cornell University says this: plants secrete compounds to feed nearby microbes, and in exchange, the microbes enable plants to capture essential nutrients such as nitrogen and manufacture a series of chemicals called phytonutrients or antioxidants. These chemicals protect plants from pests and other stressors. They also give fruits and vegetables their color, smell, and distinctive flavor. If you remember, we talked about that. You know that your food is highly nutritious if it has great color, a great smell, and distinctive flavor. Where do bacteria get these nutrients from? They get it from breaking down organisms and minerals in the soil, and they will often interact directly with plants in a symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic meaning they work closely together in a usually beneficial relationship, giving and taking. They work in a symbiotic relationship where they will colonize plant roots, protecting them from pathogens. Some bacteria even have the capability to break down pesticides, heavy metals, and other pollutants in the soil, and they break them down into less harmful substances. So far you can see that in the soil are just lots of really beneficial organisms that help plant growth. Here's a quick little fun fact. Scientists suppose that it will take 500 to 1,000 years for plastics to decompose in landfills. But they've discovered a certain fungus named Aspergillus tuberculosis, which can decompose plastic in a matter of weeks. So in landfills, it's going to take 500 to 1,000 years for these things to decompose. That's never going to happen. But life on Earth, these organisms in the soil, are so powerful that they can decompose these things that would take so long otherwise. I just found that interesting. Fungi too can form a symbiotic relationship with plants by grabbing hold of and inhabiting plant roots, acting as an extension of the roots themselves. So that's kind of different than what bacteria can do. The fungi actually spread out into the soil, their fungal filaments, and they can connect with the plants and extend their reach in the soil. And what they do is they take carbon from the root exudates of the plant and exchange it for water and minerals that they mine from the soil. So another bartering action, a give and take. According to Michael Lehman of the USDA Agriculture Research Service, these mycorrhizal fungi, as they are called, can multiply the surface area of plant roots by up to 1,000 times. So you have a plant by itself, roots are in the soil, and it's gathering nutrients and water for it to grow. Well, when it connects with these mycorrhizal fungi, this fungi acts as root extenders, and it can multiply the root surface of these roots by up to 1,000 times. The more surface area that roots have, the more nutrients they have access to, and the more stable they'll be during dry weather. So there are many things, lots of things that happen in the soil, many things I didn't cover. I didn't even really scratch the surface. But from this brief preview of the soil, we can see that soil biology is essential for healthy plant life. And while it may seem a little complex, especially when you do a deeper study and read some of these books, it can seem really complex, but the methods used to encourage soil health are fairly simple. So let's look at 7 ways that we can build, protect, and sustain soil biology and fertility. Number 1, always keep the soil covered. And I'm gonna take a quick break. I think I have some water in here. There we go.
Should we be thinking about the heart as you teach about the soil?
Say it again.
Should we be thinking about the heart as you're teaching about the soil?
Sure, yeah. As we saw in the beginning, there's a lot of correlations between the heart and the soil. And I can't think of them all right now, but if you think of some, write them down, ponder them, see if you can find that correlation in the Bible. I think it's pretty cool to discover those kinds of things. Okay. So number 1, always keep the soil covered. So we have a big slide right here. Let me break it down for you guys. Here are 7 things you can use to cover the soil. First of all, there's 7 things you can use to cover the soil, and there are pros and cons. And I'll explain why you want to keep the soil covered in a moment. So number 1 is wood chips. And wood chips are a favorite of many. Wood chips are a favorite of many, and they're very versatile, or versatile, however you pronounce that. They're great at keeping moisture in the soil and keeping weeds down and making a garden look nice, but they also add organic matter to the soil, which is really important. I don't like wood chips for everything though, because in a garden, if you put them in your growing space, it makes it hard to seed and plant just because you have to move the wood chips back every time you use them. And they can also tie up nitrogen, which means as they're decomposing, the organisms in the soil, or the microbes in the soil, they use nitrogen to break down the wood chips. So while the plants are wanting nitrogen to grow, the microbes are using the nitrogen to break down the wood chips. So if you're going to use wood chips, I would just use them in your walkways versus in the growing space for that reason. Unless they're really broken down wood chips and they're more like compost. Another thing you can use to cover the soil is straw or hay. You can also use leaves from your yard. They're great because they're free. And if you don't have any leaves, your neighbor probably has some leaves. Only thing about leaves is that they are lightweight and tend to blow away. You can also use grass clippings. You can use pine needles. The thing about pine needles is that they're allelopathic, which means that they will inhibit seed growth or seed germination or plant growth. So you don't really want those around somewhere where you're direct seeding, putting seeds in the ground, because they may not germinate. And you can see that in the forest where there's pine trees, there's usually not much growing underneath them, which is pretty cool actually for keeping weeds out of your garden. So it's, like I said, pros can become cons and cons can become pros, but it all depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Something else you can use to cover the soil is cardboard or silage tarp. Now, silage tarp is like a heavy black plastic, and either one of these, cardboard or silage tarp, can be used when you're not really gardening at the time, maybe in the winter. You can use it to just keep the garden covered so that It's not like washing away in rain, or weeds aren't growing up in the garden. Something else that you can use to cover the soil are plants. And I'll get into that in a moment. That one's kind of obvious, but here's the reasons why you want to keep the soil covered. It reduces erosion. Bare soil washes away in the rain. Wind erodes the soil, and organic matter, which is crucial to the soil, is the first to go. So that's one reason why you want to keep the soil covered. Covering the soil with mulch adds organic matter. And organic matter feeds soil life. It breaks down into nutrients that plants need. It becomes stable humus, which basically means it breaks down so much that it resists decomposition after that. And so it just builds in the soil, making it more and more fertile. And it holds the soil together. It gives better, what's called tilth to the soil. So that if you've ever seen a nice garden soil, it's not too sandy, it's not too clay, but if it has a lot of organic matter in it, it just feels right. You just know when it feels right. Similar to like if you go in a forest and you like pull back the leaves and you'll see the soil there. That's what you want in your garden. If you've ever experienced that before, just go in the woods and pull back the leaves and you'll see what nice, good, rich soil looks like. Keeping the soil covered also helps it from drying out, keeps the soil from drying out, which is beneficial for sandy, well-draining soils. And it's not so great for wet clay soils, like I talked about. If you have clay soil and it's raining a lot, you don't really want to cover the soil or else it won't dry out. But mulch can also help with drainage. So that would be great for clay soils because as mulch decomposes, it helps, it adds organic matter to the soil, which helps break up the soil and helps water to percolate or move through the soil faster. You want to keep the soil covered to keep weeds down. That's an obvious one. No one wants weeds in the garden. It keeps plants clean. So soil splashing on the garden can sometimes cause disease. And a covered soil can also keep the foods you're growing clean from soil splashing on it. So it's easier to prepare when you're about to cook. So that's just another benefit. And it keeps your feet clean because I don't always like getting my feet dirty when I go to the garden. So that's just another benefit of keeping the soil covered. Number 2 way to build the soil is keep the soil covered with plants. So that was in the last one, but more specifically, here's some things you can use to keep the soil covered with plants and the benefits of it. So just your normal crops. You always want to have something growing in the garden if possible. If there's nothing growing in the garden, then you lose that benefit of having that soil interaction of the microbes and the roots. Also, when things are in the garden, they create a canopy over the soil, which helps the soil it keeps the soil from drying out. When the soil dries out, then things just start slowing down. Microbes start going to sleep. Plants start wilting. So when you have a canopy over the soil, it helps with helps with keeping the moisture of the soil. Another way to keep the soil covered is using cover crops. And cover crops can be pretty easy to grow. If you're growing in a smaller space, it might be a little bit more difficult, but cover crops add organic matter to the soil. They improve soil structure. They bring nutrients from deep in the soil. They bring it down from the roots really deep. And after they die, all that is dispersed into the soil. They help to suppress weeds, especially when, like in the off season, when you're not growing, you can put a cover crop in to revive the soil and to keep other weeds from growing, like thorns or something that you don't actually want in the garden. And then there's basically 2 types of cover crops: non-legume cover crops, which are grown more for biomass for getting a lot of organic matter in the soil. And then legume cover crops, which are for nitrogen fixing or for getting nitrogen into the soil. And you can also mix up cover crops for more biodiversity. And cover crops also help to prevent soil erosion. And we all know that soil erosion was what caused the Dust Bowl, which is one of the biggest disasters, man-made disasters that ever occur in the world. So we always want to prevent soil erosion by always having something growing in the soil, and cover crops are a great way to do that. And so on the screen, you can see a few different kinds of cover crops. I've been using 7 a lot just because it works out. So there's rye, oats, buckwheat, daikon radish. Those are the non-legume types. They're mainly grass. The daikon radish is actually a radish that is a really deep rooter. So it breaks up the soil so that's not compacted and helps plant other plant roots. Like, so when you grow your lettuce or tomatoes or whatever, it helps those plant roots to break into the soil and go deeper than if you hadn't planted those daikon radishes beforehand. And then you have the cover crops, which help nitrogen into the soil. And I hope I'm not going too fast and all this is making some sense.
No, it's perfect.
Okay. So other ways you can cover the soil with plants, something called chop and drop. So if you're growing cover crops or just your normal crops, your normal garden vegetables or whatever, after they're done, you can chop them down at the soil surface and just lay them on the soil as a kind of mulch. You can do that with lettuce. You can do that with corn, tomatoes, anything. Once it's done growing, you can just cut out the soil surface and lay it down the soil to keep it covered. You can use beneficial plants to keep the soil covered. So those are like herbs and flowers that attract beneficial insects. And it's kind of a twofold or multiple purpose because they're covering the soil. Often these kinds of plants, they just stay in the garden. They're called perennials, so they'll grow there year after year after year. So they're covering the soil, they're interacting with the organisms in the soil. Also, they're often herbs, so they can be used for culinary or medicinal purposes, and they provide beauty for the garden, which is always a plus. The key with these, though, is that you need to plant more than you think is necessary. Plant as much as possible, because usually with beneficial or plants that attract beneficial insects like butterflies, bees, bumblebees, ladybugs, you need more of them in the garden to actually attract anything. Just one plant doesn't usually do anything. Another way to keep the soil covered, or a benefit of keeping the soil covered, is you keep roots in the ground. That's number 7. You keep roots in the ground. And the main benefit of that is it keeps the interaction between roots and the microbes. The longer that plants are in the soil, the more that symbiotic relationship or those beneficial microbe populations grow in the soil, which are breaking down minerals and making nutrients available to these plants. All right, number 3 is encourage biodiversity. This one's pretty quick because I think I'm running out of time. So just plant as many different types of plants as you can. And this helps to make the ecosystem stronger. It encourages the microbes again in the soil, and also helps to kind of recycle nutrients in the soil. So while something like corn uses a lot of nitrogen, you can plant something else, a green or a root, which will use a different kind of nutrients. And when it dies and decomposes, it puts that nutrients back in the soil, so that you're not always just mining one kind of nutrient from the soil. So biodiversity, crop rotation, that's just planting something different. Don't always plant the same thing in the same spot in your garden every single year for the same reason that I just said. On the fourth way you can improve your soil is by adding organic matter. I talked about this a little bit already, but is key to soil health. It feeds soil life. It breaks down into nutrients. It's broken down by the microbes, the fungi. It becomes stable humus. It provides long-term nutrients in the soil so that you don't have to keep on adding in fertilizers or minerals if you're doing like soil tests or that kind of stuff. And it holds the soil together, so it resists soil erosion. Sometimes when you add organic matter, you might need to add another nitrogen source because, like I said before, when it's decomposing, the microbes use nitrogen to break down the organic matter. So here's some organic matter sources. Compost. There's lots of information online and in books on making compost, making your own compost. So I'm not going to delve into that, but my best advice is if you're going to do compost, you have to be either really diligent, mixing it every day. And if you do that, it'll turn into compost really fast. All of your food scraps and all that will break down quicker if you mix it faster, mix it more often every single day. Or if you're gonna have a compost pile, then you're just gonna build it and then leave it alone and come back a year later and it'll decompose that way. So it's one or the other. Another way to add organic matter is leaf mold, which is actually really easy. That's just leaves that you make sure that just making sure that it stays moist, and the fungus and bacteria on those leaves will break down those leaves into really rich soil. And you can do that by either making like an enclosure out of chicken wire or something and putting a lot of leaves in that enclosure, like 3 feet high, 4 feet high by 4 feet wide or something like that. Or you can pile a whole bunch of leaves into a black trash bag, make sure it's moist, and just leave it there until it decomposes into soil. Then you can go back, add that to your gardens to build up the soil. Another thing you can use is manure. If you have access to cow manure or horse manure, and I know some people are adverse to those kinds of things, but historically it's been used through the millennia to develop the soil and add nitrogen and all kinds of minerals back in the soil. Only thing about that is that you can't use it fresh from an animal because the high nitrogen content can burn the plants. Another kind of manure is worm manure, which is cool because you can make your own worm bins by putting some soil in a bin, adding some worms from the soil, as many as you can find, and then you can put your kitchen scraps into that. The worms will crawl up, eat those kitchen scraps, and turn that soil into really rich soil, or vermicast, as I said before. And another way is, like we talked about before, is mulch, to increase the organic matter in your soil. And then here's some fertilizers in case you notice, like after you add organic matter, maybe your plants aren't growing so great because that nitrogen is being tied up from adding that organic matter. So there's some organic fertilizers that you can use, or plant-based organic fertilizers that you can use: alfalfa meal, peanut meal, cottonseed meal, soybean meal. And then the more common animal-based fertilizers, you can find those easier. And I put them in order of the least repulsive to the most because they're kind of weird. Manure, feather meal, just ground up feathers, chicken feathers; fish meal, ground up fishes; fish emulsion, which is blended up fish; ground up bones, bone meal; and blood meal. They're all really high in nitrogen and other kinds of nutrients. So they've been popular for the past, I don't know, 2 centuries. So if you want to use those, you can. All right, moving on. Proper watering is important for soil health. If you overwater, your soil will become anaerobic because the water will push out all the air. If the soil becomes anaerobic, that means without air, then all the good microbes in your soil will die and your plants will die, which is not good. If you underwater your garden, the soil will dry out and that can lead to compaction. Also, the good microbes will die and your plants will die if you underwater your garden. So either you just need to be really good at looking at the soil, seeing if it's moist enough or not, or a good way to make sure you're watering properly is by using a timer to schedule. If you're using a sprinkler or drip irrigation, you can use a timer to schedule the water so that it turns on and off at certain times. On the subject of drip irrigation, I'm not actually a big fan of drip irrigation because what it does is you have like these plastic hoses and it will drip water every 6, 12, or 18 inches. But that water basically goes straight down and all the soil around it basically stays dry. So the soil will dry out and the life in the soil will dry out too. So drip irrigation can be convenient, but for that reason, I don't necessarily like drip irrigation. It wouldn't be my first choice for irrigating a garden. The best way is rain. Second best would be sprinklers, or if it's a small garden, what do you call it? Watering can. Go. All right. Number 6 is avoid tillage and compaction. So you want to avoid using heavy machinery in the garden, like a tractor or a tiller, because if the soil is compacted, roots will not be able to penetrate the soil to get deep and get the nutrition that is in the soil. So they'll be dependent on that top layer of the soil to get all the nutrients. If that dries out, then the plants are there in want of nutrients. Try to avoid tillage. Tilling destroys soil biology for the most part. It blends up all of the funguses. So like I said, the fungus acts as root extenders and they have all these hyphae that go out in the soil and spread out. But if you till the soil, you basically just blend it all up and kill the fungus, or they have to start all over. You blend up worms, and it also tends to dry out the soil. And below that surface of tilling, wherever that blade stops, you leave a hard pan or a compaction layer. And when roots grow, they'll hit that and go this way instead of going down and further into the soil where there's more nutrients. So avoid tilling as much as possible. Instead, try using something called a broad fork. I was going to put a picture up of a broad fork on the PowerPoint, but I did not. So use your imagination. A broad fork is like a digging fork or a pitchfork, just broader, wider. And you basically just stomp it into the ground, wiggle it some, and you're letting air into the soil. And also you're breaking it up a little bit so that roots can penetrate the soil better, not blending the soil all up, which kills the life in the soil. Another way to avoid compaction is to have set garden beds in rows. So plan out your garden and have nice rows so for walking and beds for planting, but don't walk in the beds because that adds to the compaction. Okay, and lastly, avoid the use of chemicals. No pesticides, no herbicides, no fungicides, no chemical fertilizers. All of these are killing life in the soil, which is supposed to be helping plants grow. Also limit your use of organic fertilizers, like even the ones I listed before, because they're not always available and they're not always cost effective. I would look to use the natural sources that can be found around you, and utilize those instead of even organic fertilizers. But definitely stay away from any chemicals in your soil, which will kill soil life. Okay, that went really quick. I'm not sure how much my timer says 53 minutes went by and it's 8:18, so obviously I'm past my time. But
we were late, so we can go ahead and have our 15 minutes of Q&A then. I'm sure there's questions and questions that need to be asked and answers that need to be answered. Wonderful presentation.
all right.
I have a lot of notes.
Okay, well, I guess I'm ready for questions then. If there are
Yes.
any
Hello.
questions.
Yes. Hi, this is Donna from New York. How are you?
Doing good. How are you, Donna?
Fine. I have two questions. Number two, what's the number two from your life from the soil presentation? I missed taking all these notes. What was number two from life from the soil presentation? Sorry.
It was
Number two.
keep the soil covered with plants.
Okay.
Yeah.
Eat the soil covered plants. I have a question about that too. You had mentioned doing cover crops with and I wanted to, excuse me, ask you said about buckwheat and oat. Are those type of grains, do you have to plant a lot of that? Because I know like with wheat, you got to plant a whole lot of wheat to get, to actually have something to actually harvest. So like if you're doing a small garden, do you have to plant a whole lot of rye, a whole lot of buckwheat, a whole lot of whatever, all those type of cover crops to, to have something worth harvesting?
Yeah. Okay. So when I talked about the cover crops, typically cover crops are something that you don't actually harvest. The point of cover crop is to build the soil, add organic matter to the soil, add to help the structure of the soil, build the structure of the soil. And so typically you actually don't harvest a cover crop. But yes, buckwheat is a pseudo grain. It's not a real grain, but it's a grain that you can harvest. And oats are grains. If you want, you can definitely experiment. You can grow as much as you can in whatever space you have, and you can see how much you can harvest. Now, typically you have to, there's special ways to harvest it and preserve the grain, which I'm not an expert in that. So you have to research that. But, and I'm not sure how much you would get per, square foot, if that's what you're dealing with, or however much space you're dealing with. But you can experiment with it and see what you get. It'd be cool. I've actually had like fresh oats before, like right off the plant, and it's actually like pretty sweet. So go ahead and try it. You're probably not going to get your year's worth of oats or buckwheat, but it's cool to experiment for sure.
And you said I think is in that's zone 7, so that wouldn't be in New York. I mean, unless if you're in downstate, right? That's more like a warmer zone area.
So basically, what that was saying, that in zone 7 or colder, oats will die in the winter, which makes it easier for you to grow next spring because the cover crop will already be dead, and then you can transplant right into that dead cover crop because it becomes a mulch. You can like make it fall over, lay over the soil, and becomes a mulch. Then you can plant into that the next spring. So up north, like in New York, yes, the oats will die in the winter. Down here in Texas, they won't. They'll just keep on growing. So you have to use another way, mowing it down or using a scythe if you have one or something, just walking on it to kill it. in order to cover the soil.
So you're saying we can grow that type of grain up north. We can grow it, but it would just be a quick harvest.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, you can grow it. You just have to start it early enough so that it doesn't die in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to start it earlier in the year.
And we have a question in the chat. We have Michelle that asked the question, what can we plant now?
What can you plant now? Okay, it is February the something, 18th. Right now you can plant, well, it depends on where you are. Where are you from? I forget the name already. Who am I talking to?
That was Michelle from Texas.
Oh, Michelle from Texas. Okay. So in Texas, we're having some freakish weather right now. It's, it was 10 below. So it's not usually normal, but right now you can actually plant anything that is frost tolerant. Depending on where you are in Texas, we have like 5 different zones in Texas or more. So it's kind of hard to say. It depends on where you actually are. But typically the last frost date is in near the mid to end of March, which means that's when we'll have the last frost date. So anything that's not frost hardy or that will die if it gets below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, after that you can plant it. But other things like in the cruciferous family, like broccoli, cabbage, kale, collards, radishes, spinach is not in the cruciferous family, but spinach is frost tolerant, carrots, those kinds of things. I don't know, what else can I think?
What about your root foods, like red potatoes and the little new yellow potatoes and onions and garlic? Those things work pretty good this time of year to plant.
Potatoes.
The red potatoes, the small red potatoes, not sweet potatoes, but the red potatoes.
Okay, yeah, small red potatoes, you can't quite plant those just yet because, well, if you plant them deep enough in the soil, then they won't freeze. But
Yeah,
if they come up above
about 6 inches, you will be able to do that by experience, and it works wonders for Texas.
Okay.
And the onions.
Okay, yeah. Yep, onions too. Garlic, I think you typically plant that in the fall so that it will bulb in summer. Onions, you can grow onions and they'll get to pretty good size if you plant them in the spring. So yeah, you can plant onions. And potatoes too, I guess, as long as they don't come up before the last frost. If they come up before the last frost, then they will freeze and die. So
usually it takes a little while for them to come up.
Right, that is true.
I am just an old country girl.
I'm just an old, young city boy.
So,
Well, you're doing well.
yeah, you sound real interesting. One question, you said in the spring, so now since this weather is bad, you're saying plant them deep in the soil? I mean, is the soil, the topsoil is very, very cold, but how far down? You said 6 inches down, and even now, even though it's so very cold, you can still plant?
Are you talking about the potatoes or something else?
Well, I heard potatoes, but I was inquiring about other vegetables or other vegetation that we're interested in. What things can you plant? Would you recommend planting now or waiting until the ground is much warmer?
So we were talking about the potatoes. Those can go 6 inches below the soil, at least in Texas. And then they'll kind of sprout once it gets warmer. If your soil is frozen, then you can't really plant much of anything. If your soil
Right.
is not frozen, then those things I listed off, like the kale,
Mhm.
collards, broccoli, carrots, radishes, anything that's frost tolerant. And you can look that up online, like frost tolerant plants. You can look up
Okay.
that kind of list, and
I
they'll give you
thought
all
that's
these
what,
things that will survive.
okay. That's what I thought you said, but I got twisted a little bit when you made those references. Thank you.
Someone asked, when is a good
Okay.
time to start? When is a good time to start protecting the soil?
Good time to start protecting the soil. Now. Now would be the best time. If you can get outside, if it's not too cold, as soon as possible. Like I said, you'd never want the soil to be bare, because if it's bare, then there's soil erosion, and that's taking away organic matter. And it may not be super detrimental to have it bare, but it's always more, what's the word? There's more upside to having it covered with either having that cover crop over winter, or having a mulch over the soil, or even just cardboard or that silage tarp, that plastic on it, to keep it from eroding, or to keep something growing in the soil so that the organisms have something to eat, basically. So best time would be as soon as possible.
Okay. And next question, how do you maintain your soil if you're using raised beds?
Raised beds. How do you maintain your soil? Well, typically in a raised bed, so I guess in a raised bed, you either have soil that you brought in, I guess either topsoil or native soil, or you filled it with a mixture of soil, or maybe it's pure compost. If it's pure compost, then typically you'll just add more compost to that raised bed. And I would add a mixture of compost. So not just one kind, but several different kinds of compost if you're buying it. If you're making the compost yourself, then you can just kind of top off the top of your raised beds. And I'm assuming you mean raised bed as in like a wooden or metal raised bed, or maybe concrete raised bed. But you could top that off with compost. So if you're making your own compost, you can just top it off with your own compost. If you're buying compost, I'd recommend buying several different kinds of compost, because depending on what they're made from, will have different nutrients, different nutrient levels. So if you buy different kinds, there's a better chance that you'll get a more well-rounded nutrient level in all of those kinds of composts, and add that mixed amount in there. And that's how I would maintain that. You can also grow cover crops in a raised bed if you really wanted to, and that would still benefit the soil. There may not be much reason, because if you put compost in there already, it's basically good for the rest of its life. But yeah.
You mentioned saying using cover crops, and you also mentioned using herbs as a cover crop. Did you say that, or was I wrong in that? And if you do use herbs, can you cut them and use them? Because you said that you're not really, when you do cover crops, you don't really plant them to harvest, but with herbs, they're really beneficial. So I was wondering, if you do use herbs for cover crops, can you then use them?
Right. So the herbs, they're not necessarily cover crops per se. They're more of like when you have landscaping, you have all these different kinds of plants, and a lot of them will be perennials, which last year after year after year. So if you have a garden, an herb garden, or just a vegetable garden, you can mix in those herbs or flowers or other plants that are perennials that will live there year after year, that attract beneficial butterflies, bees, those kinds of things. But if they do happen to be herbs like lavender or rosemary, oregano, thyme, any of those kinds of things, yeah, you can definitely harvest them. You can definitely harvest those. So that's why it's like a multi-purpose plant. It's keeping the soil occupied, but you can also harvest it, and it's also attracting all these pollinators or these predatory bugs like ladybugs and stuff like that.
Another question, I'm sorry. I mean, you're pretty young. I was wondering, where did you get your knowledge? Was it all experiential, or did you go to school for this?
So I got my limited knowledge from reading books, which, oh yeah, I didn't, I kind of had a resource page at the end of my slide.
Keith has a book called The Greenhorn Gardening Guide by Keith O. Hankins. You can find his book on teachservices.com. The Greenhorn Gardening Guide on teachservices.com.
His mom is holding it up to the screen now.
So yeah, the resource is good. Okay.
I have a resource page there. It has some books that I recommend. I've read I haven't read all of these books. I perused some, but the Soul of the Soil, that's on obviously the soil and soil life. It's a really good book. I haven't read this one on composting, but Rodale Institute puts out a lot of great content, and they've been around for 70 plus years. So if you want to learn about composting, that's a great book. Worms Eat My Garbage is a fun book to read about worm composting. Building Soils for Better Crops is a book that was done by SARE, which is a Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education something or other institute or something. I don't know if that's like the USDA or NRCS or whatever, but it's like a government funded program. And so they put out these books, which are free. You can get the hard copy, you have to buy that, or you can get the free online PDF version. If you scan this QR code, you can get that on there, as well as this one down here, which is managing cover crops. Forget about the profitably part, but use managing cover crops. A great book on that. And then the Garden Primer is a good book for gardening. And then the Holistic Orchard for Fruit Trees by Michael Phillips. That's a really good book. And then also on this QR code, if you scan it, I put some articles which back up some of the stuff I have in this presentation, and also just some interesting things to read about, like how funguses and bacteria are able to decompose toxins or plastic or other fun articles, if you like to read articles, stuff like that. And then like Ms. Yashara was saying, let's see, there's my book. You can go to teachservices.com and search Greenhorn, and it will pop up, or you can scan this QR code. And I hope these QR codes work. I didn't scan them myself, so I don't know if they'll work.
They do.
Okay, cool.
I just scanned them and they do. It works.
Yep.
Okay, good.
If you missed the beginning is when he did his bio. He's been developing his gardening and agriculture for over 5 years. So it's not, beside his own garden, he's been spending 3 years on other people's gardens from the West Coast to the South. So he's been doing this for many years.
A few years.
Yeah, don't exaggerate.
Many years.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for you. Like, I mean, I don't really know how to garden. I tried to do some radishes. It came out mighty puny. You know, started I think like in the end of September, early October. I ended up basically getting something around early November, but it looked too tiny to even eat. So, but I tried. Where do you suggest that I start? What do I begin? I'm in the north. It's freezing outside. It snows outside. What should I do tomorrow or next week to start?
So you're in New York, right?
And it's freezing.
It's freezing. It's freezing down here too. Well, so while it's freezing, I'm sure you have a little bit of downtime, 10 minutes, 30 minutes. Grab one of these books. I would recommend to start off The Garden Primer by Barbara Damrosch. It's a big book, so it's not one that you just like read through. It's more like an encyclopedia of gardening. So you want to grow radishes. You open that book, find radishes, and she'll tell you how to grow radishes in that book. That's how I started. I had a different book. I didn't read this one. I had a different book by Rodale. It was called the Vegetable Garden Problem Solver. I would recommend that one too. I got it for like $1 off of Amazon when they were selling resale books. Maybe they still do that. But well, shipping was probably like $5, so they trick you like that. So $6 total. It's still a bargain because when it came out, it was probably like $20. Anyways, the Vegetable Garden Problem Solver. It just tells you about each one of these crops that you're interested in growing. And if you just follow the instructions, you will typically come out with what you're wanting. So radishes are pretty easy to grow in the sense that they don't take very long. They're like 3 weeks to harvest. So maybe you just didn't plant them at the right time.
Yeah.
Someone asked, if you're short on space, how many times can you plant the same crop in the same space?
Well, you can plant it there as many times as you want. Yeah. There's no, I can't tell you not to plant it there. But my question is, why would you want to plant it there over and over again? There's lots of other things you can grow, which are tasty and fun to eat and nutritious. So if you can, I would mix it up. If you can, it won't kill your garden.
I just want to ask you, okay, for survival, right? We're basically, we're not sure what's going to happen, but I was actually, I was showing someone some of my seeds. They were like, "Oh, Donna, you have a great salad right here." I basically had ordered seeds, and most of it was just, I guess, greens for salad. So, for survival purposes, what should we have in our garden? If we're going to survive, let's say we don't have access to a store, what are some things we should always have in a garden so we can somehow just survive?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is storage crops. So anything that you can store, that'd be potatoes, both kinds, the white potatoes or red skin potatoes, and sweet potatoes. Squashes are storable, butternut squash, acorn squash, pumpkins, any other kinds of squashes, carrots, any roots, carrots, oh, not any roots, but carrots, turnips, rutabaga, celeriac, which is a weird one. Any kinds of roots are storable. So things you can store over many months so that you can have food to bring out of storage. Also, foods that are just really high in nutrition or nutrients, like kale and spinach, greens, those kinds of things, which you can just cut and eat, and they're kind of low maintenance. So those would be the 3 things highest on my list: roots, squash, greens, and radishes too, because they grow really fast. So if you're running out of time, you're getting hungry, you only have 3 weeks left to live because you're running out of food, radishes will be there for you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We know we were late, but
Oh, I have one more question.
oh, go ahead.
When you have produce that has a lot of holes in them, what would be the I would say the nutrients content of that food, you know, bugs eating on them.
So if you
Would
have
that
bugs,
be a sign that something is missing in the soil?
that is a sign that something's missing in the soil. And honestly, pests and bugs will bother every single garden because the soil isn't perfect and it never will be perfect on this earth.
Okay.
That's just something we're gonna have to deal with. But if you have a lot of pest problems, if your plants are covered in bugs and they're just super holy,
Right.
then you definitely need to focus on building your soil fertility, adding that organic matter, um, all these other things that I presented in this program. But if none of those are working, then I would look into getting a soil test to see if
Okay.
you can balance those minerals. And you can connect with your, what's it called? The,
Oh, the co-op or something?
yeah, the extensions
Yeah, the extension.
for, yeah, whatever ag school is nearest you, you can connect with the
Okay.
extension office and they can help you with the soil test.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks for listening, everyone.
We have one more question. What can you put in the garden to get rid of grasshoppers? In Hillsborough, they come out at the beginning of June.
Grasshoppers in Hillsborough. Grasshoppers actually are the one pest that will eat anything in sight. So they're not they're not particular about what they want to eat. Whereas like some worms will only eat one kind of plant, or like aphids will only suck on one kind of plant. Grasshoppers will eat anything. So that is because their digestive system allows them to do that. And it means that it basically means that your soil is probably pretty wanting in some nutrients. So I could give you, well, I can't remember what it is, but there's like pesticides you can use to get rid of grasshoppers, but also you can focus on building your soil fertility, your soil health with these principles. And hopefully those grasshoppers will not be able to digest the food in your garden because it becomes less digestible to them. Healthy food, healthy produce, one thing I didn't talk about, healthy produce, the antioxidants, minerals, different nutrients inside of that food makes it undigestible to bugs. So the same way like that we can't really digest grass very well because we don't have the digestive system to do that, bugs can only digest your plants when the chemical, I can't get too much into this, but the chemical balance changes when they're unhealthy versus when they're healthy. So when they're unhealthy, bugs can eat them. They like to eat them. They're attracted to them. When they're healthy, the balance in the chemistry of that plant makes it unpalatable to bugs. So they don't even want to eat it. So that's why it's so important to focus on soil health versus just trying to get rid of a problem. If that makes sense.
Yes. Very helpful. I think everyone learned a lot this evening.
One other question. Since you live in Texas, how far do you travel? Do you have to book an appointment? Say, hey, could you help me with my garden? Jumpstart it, get it working right. Tell me, like hands-on. Do you do that?
I have done that in the past. Will I do it now? Maybe I will do that for you. Maybe I'll do that for you. I don't have a car though, so.
Oh man, I was gonna say I'll pay you. I used to live in Houston. I know your folks.
Okay. Uh, if I can find a way to get over there, wherever you are, I'll help you out.
Oh,
I just have to
okay.
find a way to get.
Regina, give him my number.
That's Yashara.
Will do.
Okay.
May
I'm
I have his
ready.
email? I'm sorry, may I have his email if it's possible to ask questions? Is there an email that we can contact you? Sorry.
You want me to give out the company email or personal email, or what do you want me to do?
You can give out my email.
Okay, that'll work.
Okay, I have his email. I'll get it out. I know who that was that's asking.
Okay, or just put it in the chat. We have one last question in the chat. I always get tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, etc. But whenever I plant cabbages or broccoli, the leaves are eaten badly. What do you think may be the problem? And have you used the E.G. White method of planting?
Okay. What do I think is happening with the? So they're probably being eaten by cabbage looper caterpillars, those little green inchworms, nail or a slug or something, but it's probably a worm, a caterpillar. And they tend to like when it when the plant has taken up a lot of nitrogen. So while plants need nitrogen to grow, if there's too much nitrogen in the soil, then bugs usually start attacking. But it could be something else. It could be some other deficient, or there's too much of. If they're really bad, you can use something that's easy, is soapy water. Spraying it on the leaves will kill those caterpillars or those worms or whatever they are. You just have to be diligent with it, checking the leaves, making sure you're spraying them off. And then there's other pesticides that you can, organic pesticides that you can buy, but soapy water works great. You just have to make sure you get all over the leaf surface, underneath it, above it. And while you're spraying, focus on building the soil, focus on the soil health. Get a soil test if you need to, but add compost to the soil, keep it covered, always have something growing in the soil, whether it's just a normal crop or a cover crop, those kinds of things. Mulches.
And another question was, have you ever used the LNG White method of planting?
Oh, right. I have. I don't see it though, so I can't really give you any results on it. I have planted quite a few trees the LNG White method, so I'm assuming you'd want to know if it works or not. I've heard that it works. I've actually planted or worked with Lynn Hoag, who he's the one who you probably heard it from, or maybe not, but he promotes it nowadays. And I've seen the trees that he's grown and they grow. They're big and healthy. And I've heard from other people that it works well. So I would go ahead and try it out if that's what you're wanting to know.
All right, let's close out with prayer.
Okay, if we would bow our heads. Father in heaven, Lord, we're just so grateful and thankful, Lord, that you give us an opportunity to be taught of you, Lord. We thank you, dear Father, for all the wisdom that you've given your dear son, Keith. In just a short amount of time, Lord, you've given him wonderful wisdom. And we just thank you, Lord, that he was granted the opportunity to share with us this evening. We just pray and ask, Lord, that you would aid us in absorbing all the things that were shared with us. And I pray that you would give us the patience, Lord, and the want to and the desire, Lord, to get our hands dirty and to get down and to work with that soil, Lord, and to learn and be taught of you. We ask, dear Lord, that you would now bless our future crops, Lord. Bless our future plantings, Lord. Help us, Lord, to learn much, Lord, as we begin to garden or continue in our gardening, Lord, as you so desire. We pray, dear Lord, that as we garden, it will be a blessing for us. And Lord, we pray that we will be able to bless others, Lord, with the bountiful blessings, Lord, that you will give unto us. We just ask, dear Lord, that you will be with each and every individual on this call. Bless them in a special way. And we ask, dear Lord, that you will continue to bless Keith, Lord, in his future endeavors. These and all other blessings, Lord, we ask in your name, and we thank you. Amen.
Amen. That was
Amen.
wonderful.
It was.